after leaving his pregnant wife. He's shocked to see her on national TV. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Sophie stood in the rain, her suitcase heavy with everything she could salvage from the home she once shared with Ethan. Her fingers gripped the handle tightly, the cold seeping into her skin. The echo of Ethan's accusations still rang in her ears. "You're a liar, Sophie," he'd spat. "That baby isn't mine." The pain cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Ethan's words, his rejection, and his abandonment were more than she could bear. She looked down at her growing belly, a hand instinctively resting over the child within her. Tears mixed with the rain as she whispered, "It's just you and me now." Sophie had always believed in justice. It was the one thing she clung to, the principle that kept her grounded. But justice, it seemed, had turned its back on her. Ethan had thrown her out of their home with no money, no support, and no remorse. Yet, as she boarded the bus to nowhere, Sophie resolved to find a way to survive. Not just for herself, but for the life she was bringing into the world. Life as a single mother was unimaginably hard. Sophie moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, working long hours as a waitress at a local diner. Each shift blurred into the next as she juggled the demands of her job with the needs of her infant son. Mac's nights were spent studying old legal textbooks borrowed from the public library. Becoming a lawyer had always been her dream, but she had abandoned it when Ethan convinced her to focus on their life together. Now, she clung to that dream as if it were her only lifeline. She worked tirelessly, her determination fueled by the tiny face that greeted her each morning. Max became her anchor, his innocent giggles and wide-eyed wonder reminding her of the purpose behind her sacrifices. There were nights when exhaustion pulled her into the depths of despair, but Sophie refused to give in. She couldn't afford to. Her break came unexpectedly. While working a late shift, Sophie struck up a conversation with a kind customer named Mr. Anderson, a retired attorney who had once been a regular at the diner. He noticed her scribbling notes on a napkin during her breaks and asked about her interest in law. With a gentle smile, he offered to mentor her, and Sophie's journey toward reclaiming her dream began in earnest. Over the next few years, Sophie juggled motherhood, work, and law school. Mr. Anderson's guidance became invaluable, and his encouragement pushed her through the darkest moments. By the time she graduated, Sophie had become a force to be reckoned with. A sharp, analytical mind tempered by compassion and resilience. Her first few years as a practicing attorney were humbling. She took on pro bono cases, representing individuals who had been overlooked or wronged by the system. Each victory fueled her belief in justice, and each setback reminded her of the importance of perseverance. Her reputation grew steadily, and by the time Max was ready for kindergarten, Sophie was making a name for herself in the legal community. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was unraveling. His career had stalled, his relationships were superficial, and his financial situation was precarious. He had heard whispers of Sophie's success but dismissed them as exaggerated tales. After all, he had written her off years ago, convinced she would never amount to anything without him. What he didn't realize was that Sophie's success wasn't just professional, it was personal. She had built a life for herself and Max that was rich in love and purpose. Every case she took on reminded her of the struggles she had faced, and she poured her heart into ensuring her clients received the justice they deserved. One day, Sophie was approached with a high-profile case that could catapult her career to new heights. A multinational corporation was being sued for unethical practices, and the case had garnered national attention. Sophie knew it was a daunting challenge, but she also knew it was an opportunity to shine a light on corruption and stand up for those who had been wronged. As she prepared for the trial, Sophie threw herself into her work, determined to leave no stone unturned. The stakes were high, but she was no stranger to pressure. Each late night in her office, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal briefs, reminded her of the journey that had brought her here. The trial began amidst a media frenzy, with reporters and cameras documenting every moment. Sophie stood tall, her presence commanding the courtroom. Her opening statement was a masterclass in eloquence and conviction, leaving the opposing counsel scrambling to counter her arguments. In the audience, Ethan sat unnoticed, his jaw tightening as he watched Sophie in action. He had stumbled upon the case while flipping through channels, and curiosity had driven him to attend the trial in person. What he saw left him speechless. This wasn't the Sophie he had abandoned. This was a woman transformed, a fierce advocate for justice who owned the room with her confidence and intellect. For the first time, Ethan felt a pang of regret. He realized the magnitude of what he had lost, but he also knew it was too late. Sophie had moved on, and she was thriving in a way he never imagined possible. The trial continued, with Sophie dismantling the defense's arguments piece by piece. Her relentless pursuit of the truth earned her the admiration of the court and the public. By the time the verdict was delivered, Sophie had secured a landmark victory that would set a precedent for years to come. As reporters swarmed her outside the courthouse, Sophie held Max's hand tightly, her other hand clutching the court documents that symbolized her triumph. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions poured in from every direction. Through it all, Sophie remained poised, her voice steady as she spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart heavy with regret and shame. The woman he had dismissed as unworthy of his support had risen to heights he could only dream of. And now the world knew her name. The media storm following Sophie's victory was overwhelming. News channels and online outlets couldn't get enough of her story. Headlines like "Sophie Harper, the attorney fighting for the underdog and single mother takes on corporate giant," and wins flooded the internet. Interviews poured in, but Sophie carefully chose her appearances, focusing on platforms that highlighted the causes she cared about. Ethan, glued to his television, watched every segment with a mix of awe and dread. He couldn't look away as Sophie recounted her journey during a primetime special. Her voice was calm but firm as she described the sacrifices she had made and the battles she had fought to stand where she was now. "Sophie Harper, you've become a national figure seemingly overnight," the interviewer began, leaning forward with interest. "Your story resonates with so many people. Single mothers, aspiring lawyers, and anyone who's ever felt underestimated. How did you find the strength to keep going?" Sophie smiled softly, her gaze momentarily flicking to Max, who sat just off camera, engrossed in a book. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "There were times when I felt like giving up, but I always reminded myself who I was fighting for. My son deserved a better life, and I wasn't going to let him grow up thinking we were defined by someone else's abandonment." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "You're referring to your ex-husband?" Sophie didn't flinch. "Yes. He walked out on us when I was pregnant. At the time it felt like my world had collapsed, but looking back it was the best thing that could have happened. It forced me to find my strength and create a life for myself and my son." Ethan winced as he heard those words. The subtle sting of her statement pierced through his chest. Sophie wasn't bitter or vindictive. She was simply stating the truth. And the truth hurt. As Sophie's fame grew, so did her opportunities. She received offers to partner with major law firms, invitations to speak at universities, and requests to join national panels on legal reform. But Sophie remained grounded. She turned down lucrative deals, choosing instead to continue her work with marginalized communities. Her victories in court became victories for people who had been silenced for far too long. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was unraveling at an alarming rate. His career in real estate had hit rock bottom after a series of bad investments. His relationships were shallow and fleeting, and the financial stability he once prided himself on was now a distant memory. Watching Sophie's rise to prominence only magnified the emptiness he felt. One night, unable to bear the weight of his regret, Ethan sat down with a drink in hand and opened a blank email. He typed and deleted several drafts, struggling to find the words to reach out to Sophie. Finally, he settled on a simple message. "Sophie, I saw your interview on TV. I'm sorry for everything. I'd like to meet and talk if you're open to it." He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the send button. But before he could act, the memory of their final argument played in his mind. His accusations, her tears, the way she had begged him to stay, only for him to turn his back. Overcome with shame, Ethan closed his laptop without sending the message. The weeks rolled on, and Sophie's presence in the media continued to grow. Her next big case involved a whistleblower who had exposed corruption within a pharmaceutical company. The case was even more high-profile than the last, with stakes that could reshape the industry. Sophie's meticulous preparation and unwavering determination earned her praise from colleagues and fear from opponents. Ethan, desperate to see her in person, attended one of her public speaking engagements. It was held at a university auditorium, packed with students and professionals eager to hear Sophie's insights. Ethan slipped into the back row, his heart pounding as he caught sight of her on stage. Sophie was a vision of poise and confidence, her voice commanding the room as she shared stories of her most challenging cases. She spoke about the importance of integrity, empathy, and perseverance. The audience hung on her every word, breaking into applause multiple times during her speech. When the event ended, Ethan lingered near the exit, hoping for a chance to speak to her. But as Sophie stepped off the stage, she was immediately surrounded by admirers, colleagues, and reporters. Ethan hesitated, then turned and walked away, overwhelmed by the realization that he no longer had a place in her life. Back at his apartment, Ethan poured himself another drink and stared at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. His thoughts were consumed by Sophie, her strength, her resilience, and the incredible life she had built without him. He felt an ache deep in his chest, a mix of guilt, admiration, and a longing for something he could never have again. One evening, as he scrolled through social media, Ethan stumbled upon a live-streamed event. Sophie was receiving an award for her contributions to the legal field. The event was lavish, attended by prominent figures in law, politics, and media. Ethan watched as Sophie took the stage, Max by her side, to accept the honor. Her speech was powerful, filled with gratitude for the people who had supported her and a message of hope for those still fighting their battles. But it was her closing words that struck Ethan the hardest. "To those who doubted me, abandoned me, or underestimated me," Sophie said, her voice steady but firm, "thank you. You gave me the push I needed to find my strength and prove that I'm more than enough on my own." The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation echoing through the venue. Ethan, sitting alone in his dimly lit apartment, felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He realized with painful clarity that he had not only lost Sophie but also any chance of redemption in her eyes. As the night wore on, Ethan made one last attempt to reach out. He typed another email, pouring his heart into an apology that he knew could never undo the damage he had caused. This time he hit send. Sophie received the email late that night. She stared at it for a long moment before closing her laptop without replying. She had moved on, and no amount of words could change the past. Months passed, and Sophie's life continued to flourish. Her reputation as a fierce advocate for justice grew with each case she took on. Max, now a curious and bright 6-year-old, was her greatest joy. Every victory she achieved, every accolade she earned, she dedicated to him. Sophie had learned to balance her career with motherhood, creating a life filled with love, purpose, and fulfillment. Meanwhile, Ethan's descent into obscurity accelerated. The regrets he carried felt heavier with each passing day. His name was barely a footnote in the world Sophie now dominated. He often scoured the news for updates about her, reading articles and watching interviews, torturing himself with reminders of what he had lost. Sophie's rise felt like a cruel mirror reflecting his failure. One day, while walking through the city, Ethan noticed a crowd gathered around a large screen outside an electronics store. Curious, he approached and froze as Sophie's face appeared on the screen. It was a live broadcast of a congressional hearing, and Sophie was testifying as an expert witness on corporate malpractice and systemic corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched Sophie handle the intense questioning with unwavering composure. Her responses were sharp, her knowledge undeniable. She didn't just command the room, she owned it. The senators praised her insights, and the audience erupted into applause multiple times during the session. As the broadcast ended, the camera zoomed in on Sophie's face. Her expression was calm, determined, and resolute, a far cry from the woman Ethan had abandoned years ago. The realization hit him like a freight train. Sophie had become everything he had once dismissed as impossible, and she had done it without him. Ethan's spiral of self-pity was interrupted a few weeks later by an unexpected letter. It was an invitation to attend the unveiling of a community center funded by Sophie Harper's latest legal victory. Intrigued and unable to resist the chance to see her in person, Ethan decided to go. The event was held in a bustling neighborhood, with a large stage set up in front of the newly built center. The crowd buzzed with excitement as Sophie took the stage, flanked by local leaders and community members. Max stood proudly beside her, holding her hand. Sophie's speech was as inspiring as ever. She spoke about the importance of giving back, of using one's success to uplift others. The crowd erupted in cheers as she announced that the center would provide free legal services, career counseling, and childcare for single parents, a resource she wished she'd had during her darkest days. Ethan stood in the back, his heart pounding as Sophie finished her speech and began mingling with the crowd. Summoning every ounce of courage, he approached her. "Sophie," he said softly. She turned, her expression shifting as recognition dawned. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Ethan saw a flicker of the woman he had once known, but it was quickly replaced by the confident and self-assured person she had become. "What are you doing here?" Sophie asked, her tone polite but distant. "I got the invitation," Ethan stammered. I wanted to see you. To say I'm sorry." Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "Sorry for what?" "For everything," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "For not believing you, for walking out, for abandoning you and Mac." Sophie's eyes softened for a moment before she straightened her posture. "Ethan, I don't need your apology. Max and I have built a good life, one that you're not a part of. I hope you've found peace with your choices, but they don't define me anymore." Her words were firm but not unkind. Ethan felt the finality in them, the unshakable truth that Sophie had moved on and was stronger for it. As Ethan walked away from the event, he was struck by the weight of his own failures. Sophie's strength and resilience had turned her into someone the world admired, while he had let his bitterness and insecurities consume him. For the first time in years, Ethan resolved to change, not to win Sophie back, but to finally rebuild his own life. He took steps to address his financial troubles, sought therapy for the guilt and shame he carried, and began volunteering at local shelters. Slowly, he started to find a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Sophie's career reached new heights. Her testimony at the Congressional hearing sparked a series of reforms that transformed the pharmaceutical industry. She was hailed as a national hero, earning awards and recognition from organizations across the country. But Sophie's greatest achievement wasn't her professional success. It was the life she had built with Max. Each night, as she tucked him into bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had shaped her into the person she was today. One evening, as she and Max sat together on their porch, watching the sunset, he asked, "Mom, are you happy?" Sophie smiled, pulling him close. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." And she meant it. For Sophie, justice wasn't just something she fought for in court. It was the life she had claimed for herself and her son. A life filled with love, purpose, and triumph. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.